Excerpts from the 725th Official Contact Report of the 12th of October, 2019.
In this respect, therefore, these factors in particular cannot be identified in various ways, but first and foremost, only as malicious deforestation and destruction of all bases of life for humanity and the whole of nature, with its fauna and flora, which are brought about willfully and criminally out of ignorance and unreason, as a result of money-greed considerations. Especially the destruction of forests cannot be an unintended consequence, as it also does not correspond to sustainable forest management, which means that greed is the sole driving force behind all destruction, but also that there is a lack of knowledge about the consequences of human actions. Therefore, the destruction of forests, nature, fauna and flora, freshwaters and oceans as well as the climate continues unhindered. And this is also due to the lack of consciousness, thought and feeling, as well as the lack of understanding and reason, and the pathological profit thinking with regard to the fact that horrendous money can be raked in the short term, but that enormous destruction of the entire planet is knowingly accepted. And this has nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that deforestation is caused, for example, by natural tree diseases, or if any natural external influences occur, such as pollutants from volcanic eruptions, etc. The entire causal primal driving forces of all slash and burn, forest fire and commercial forest clearing and deforestation are based in the exuberant development of overpopulation, in which human beings are getting older and older, and therefore more and more human beings are born than die. That, as a result of the ignorance and irrationality of most of humanity, the rapid and inexorable increase in the world's population is driving and encouraging the steady increase in deforestation in every way is absolutely clear. But it is incomprehensible that, as a result of personal egoism, people continue to produce offspring thoughtlessly and irresponsibly, because on the one hand, the whole thing is simply dismissed as a private matter, and on the other hand, neither reason, rationality nor responsibility are brought to bear. All those young and middle-aged earthlings who continue to beget and bring children into the world out of sheer egoism, because they simply like children, want to have children, think children are cute, or think that it is their right to have children, do not think about the fact that they are bringing their offspring into a world in which more and more destruction is occurring. Nor does it occur to them that children born into today's world will find many parts of it already destroyed, and also that their presence will inevitably contribute greatly to the further destruction of Earth, nature, fauna, and flora, as well as the atmosphere and climate, which will have very serious consequences for all Earth's humanity. It is still being predicted by crazy researchers, scientists, and other lunatics with regard to the growth of overpopulation that the increase in the world's population will reach 9 to 10 billion human beings by the year 2050. And this, madly and completely erroneously, although according to exact Plejarians counts, Earth's humanity had an overpopulation of no less than 9,60,794,141 equals, that is to say 9,60,794,141 Earth humans at midnight, 0 o'clock, HRS on 31.12. 2019-2020, and thus at the beginning of the year 2020, the limit of 9 billion was already far exceeded. This is in contrast to the naive assumptions of the earthly population counters, who with their world population count clock at the present time, precisely now in the month of January 2020, come to a current Earth population of just 7 billion and approx. 700 million Earthlings. The fact is that deforestation will continue to increase rapidly in all countries of the Earth, especially in tropical countries, because the pressure for further land reclamation will inevitably increase in relation to the growing overpopulation. In the process, as has been the case for a long time, and is also the case now and in the future, more and more political and social problems will arise as a result of overpopulation, which will play important roles and will be difficult to solve. In this respect, the entire agricultural economy will be affected, as well as the empire of the energy corporations, the entire multifaceted economic system, technological developments, as well as social norms and values, and much more. There will also inevitably be a total transformation of the existing forests, because it will correspond to an unavoidable necessity, as well as new reforms in other forms of land use, although forests will continue to be cleared, but probably through controlled clear-cutting. And this, I believe, will be inevitable, destroying more and more of nature and fauna and flora. This, if the Earthlings, with regard to their childbearing selfishness, do not finally learn to bear sense, reason, and responsibility towards the planet Earth itself, and its resources as well as nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate, and all life and existence in general. If the whole world is considered in relation to all building in every respect, be it dwellings, bridges, soul launching pads such as churches, temples, synagogues and mosques and other delusional palaces, etc., for which building land must not infrequently also be obtained by clearing forests, then Europe is almost to be praised in this respect, because today, as a rule, forests may only be cleared in special cases for a few building projects, although special exceptions are made for military purposes, which in principle should also be prohibited. Elsewhere, however, in North America and North Asia, for example, forest areas are irresponsibly cleared for mining, that is to say, for the extraction of fossil fuels, especially for oil, natural gas or tar sand, while in Latin America, Southeast Asia and Africa, agriculture is mostly practiced on cleared forest areas, whereby new slash-and-burn operations are regularly carried out every second or third year, because normally, after this time, the nutrient power of the former forest soil is used up and cannot be renewed. And this is also the case when the cultivated plants are soy, as is the case especially in South America or in Indonesia, where only palm trees are planted for the production of palm oil or palm heart production. Otherwise, land that has been cleared or reclaimed in the normal way is used for plantations, where particularly fast-growing tree species are planted, mostly eucalyptus species or pines, but also especially Monterey pines, whose wood is used primarily in paper production. This is while there has been pressure on the so-called primary forests, especially in the last 2 or 3 decades. In this respect, there has been pressure on boreal forests, that is to say on conifers that, like the cold temperate climate, which is also called boreal coniferous forest climate, snow forest climate, or subarctic climate. Boreal, if I try to translate this word from ancient Greek, that is to say boreas, then it means something like the northern one, which then means the northern climate, such as that of Europe, North Asia and North America, whereby, as far as I know, the subpolar climate in the northern hemisphere is called this, which, as a northern climate, if I remember correctly, is the coldest of the types of climate in the temperate zone, which largely corresponds to the boreal vegetation zone. Another point to mention is that the ever-increasing demand for biofuels has greatly increased their demand, as well as the industrial demand for large and far-reaching projects of all kinds, causing huge changes that involve the production of enormous amounts of CO2. But this is also true of small-scale shifting cultivation in Latin America and Madagascar, which can only be sustained by deforestation. If we are now talking about the rainforest and all forests and trees, then I think I can also draw somewhat on my knowledge in this regard, and say that if there is even a modicum of understanding of the tree economy, and thus also of the timber industry, then the whole thing must also be considered from a purely economic point of view. Actually, I wanted to talk about illegal logging before I just had to mention some things because I was forced to, but now it has happened. But now it is time to say that I will also have to mention something about wood pests, which I learned a lot about from Svath in my adolescence, and from my time working in the forest with my father and forester Schweizer. But first I must come to the conclusion that effectively certain necessary conversions of forest areas must also be considered and carried out, because this is really unavoidable. Subsequently, it must be recognized, when the characteristics of many kinds of goods and services with regard to forests are considered, that they are by no means profitable, but only extremely intensively labor-intensive. Forests that are supposed to grow good wood require decades of diverse work and care, which takes a lot of effort, strength, and hardship, and corresponds to a long-term and continuous process, because timber trees need many decades to reach harvestable age. Moreover, there are no real markets for forests that would make their preservation profitable, although it is also important to note that forests are also CO2 reservoirs and that their oxygen production is also important. Good tree management is not only very laborious in terms of decades of work and care, but it also requires, which I already learned as a 6-year-old from my father, from Svath, and from the community forester when I worked in the forest with my father and the forester, that sequencing is also of great importance for tree, that is to say, silviculture. This means that a determination, that is to say, formation of a sequence and production, must be thought through and carried out as part of a production planning and production sequence to be determined. Forests are indeed forests, but nevertheless not simply forests, as I learned as a boy, but forests consist of trees, and these are independent life forms, which nevertheless stand in connection with the entire fauna and flora, as a result of which they are classified in a coexistence with many living beings of the most diverse genera and species, both for their own benefit and for the mutual benefit of all other life forms. And this is to be understood as starting with the mycorrhiza, that is to say the mushroom root and its dense thread network, from which mushroom plants emerge, with which trees as well as bushes live together. But this is not enough, because this symbiotic coexistence of living beings of different genera and species happens for mutual benefit. Everything is included, which encompasses the entire great biodiversity of the forest flora and the structure of the entire forest stands. This also includes the entire animal kingdom and the bird kingdom, etc., all of which together form a fascinating community of life in the forest. The large number of diverse plant life forms, such as hair clover, arum, wild garlic and blackberries, etc. Also many insects of diverse genera and species, as well as ants, beetles, caterpillars, spiders and deer, foxes, deer, lynxes and badgers, etc., form important interactions in the forests as a whole. The genera and species diversity of forest fauna and flora and the structure of forest stands are also vital in their entirety for all of humanity. The interactions of the entire forest vegetation as well as the entire vegetation of all meadows, floodplains and fields, stream, river and lake banks, as well as moors and swamps and gravel pits and mountains, etc., are absolutely vital and indispensable for all life in general. And this can only exist if everything functions with regard to the relationships between the individual plants, insects and animals, etc., and thus the entire environment of ecology, and consequently also with the interrelationships between all living beings and their environment. Therefore, the entire nature, fauna and flora destroying, annihilating and exterminating as well as irresponsible thinking and acting of the earthlings with regard to the further uncontrolled, egoistic and excessive breeding of offspring corresponds to an unparalleled crime against humanity. Furthermore, it must be said that forests are also overexploited by incorrect management and, as a result of ignorance and stupidity, destroyed or driven into degeneration, whereby they lose the ability to regenerate and consequently become extremely susceptible to pests, as well as to the danger of forest fires. And if forest pests are added to the equation, then a wide variety of animals and creatures come to the fore, various game and insects, as well as even plants that feed on forest trees. Although this corresponds to a natural process, it becomes problematic when the forest can no longer provide important services for human beings, such as when excessive pests occur and become invasive, that is to say, spread widely. This is precisely the case when mass propagation occurs, such as with the bark beetle from the family of species-rich weevils, of which many species reproduce under the bark or in the wood of trees in self-drilled tunnels, and which sometimes cause great economic damage, about which little or nothing is known in the population, but which is certainly interesting to mention. For example, most bark beetle species penetrate the bark of timber and eat everything. Many species feed on the somewhat nutrient-rich part of the so-called leader bundle, which serves to transport the substances formed in the leaves within a tree. Bark beetles are not beetles and grubs that only attack conifers, because although some are only found on one group of related tree species, such as a particular genus, most wood-eating species are targeted at quite different types of wood, with a few even attacking hardwoods and even various conifers. However, most bark beetle species that prefer and use living trees can also be found on deadwood, which they even specialize in, just as there are species that specialize in branches, twigs, and roots. Several species also live inside conifer cones, while a few other groups have turned to completely different food sources. Also in southern areas, where southern fruits grow, there are similar pests, such as the coffee cherry beetle, which does not attack the wood of coffee trees, but the fruits of date palms, and thus causes a lot of damage in southern agriculture. But this is also the case with other genera and species, such as one which, as I have observed for myself in southern countries, especially in Iraq, attacks the seeds and unripe fruits of dates. Other species live in leaves or petioles, others in the roots of herbaceous and non-woody plant species. In this way, however, I know that a cloverbark beetle has also spread in Central Europe in the roots of herbaceous leguminous plants. Bark beetles of a certain genus, Samsonius or so, if I still remember this name correctly, have developed a kleptoparasitic way of life, which I simply translate as parasitic stealing with regard to my knowledge of Greek. This term refers to the fact that kleptoparasitism means taking advantage of other life forms, that is to say, a parasitic exploitation or stealing. This can be with insects, animals or birds, etc., in terms of food or nesting opportunities, such as the cuckoo, which uses the nests of other birds and lays eggs in them, which are hatched by the other birds, which then feed and raise the cuckoo's offspring. Kleptoparasitism also exists in human behavior, when people take advantage of each other's labor or other services, but also in relation to things or financial resources. Among the quite numerous species of bark beetles, there are only a few species that are bound to living conifers, which are then brought to death by their infestation. The majority of all species are secondary pests, that is to say so-called weak parasites, because they exclusively attack and colonize diseased or dying trees, because these only have a weak resistance. However, these nail beetles, which number only about 20 species, quickly multiply into mass populations, and as a result of their rapidly increasing population density of millions, can cause entire forests to die within a few years, causing forest owners and the forestry industry to suffer losses in the millions. In addition to the bark beetle commonly known in Europe, the book printer, that is to say the large eight-toothed spruce bark beetle, which corresponds to a subfamily of bark beetles, and which, as a bark-breeding insect, inserts its breeding systems into the bark of the host trees, is also important. The boxbark beetle corresponds to a bark beetle species that also attacks mountain forests, and they can cause these to die, just as insects and wild animals can do. At the very least, however, the timber is devalued, just as important forest functions are also endangered. It is undeniable that impairments and collapses of forest stands due to insect infestation are part of the natural forest dynamics. But if protective forests and commercial forests are infested, then damage occurs on a large scale. For forestry as a whole, as well as for nature and all its harmless life forms, stable, site-suitable, and healthy forest stands are a very important prerequisite, because only in this way can they be protected from pest infestation, or at least pests of the various genera and species can be kept within limits. However, if a forest is planted in an unfavorable manner, or if unfavorable extreme climatic and weather conditions occur on a permanent basis, then the risks for the entire respective stand arise or increase, which may result in considerable damage. And such damage can also result when certain invasive neophytes, that is to say foreign trees, that is to say introduced species, invade the surrounding forest stands and grow into them, driving out native species and causing their extinction. For plants that have only been around since the alleged discovery of America in 1492, which corresponds to an enormous error, because Christopher Columbus was not the first to set foot on American soil from foreign lands, but very early on other human beings who came via the early land connection of today's Bering Strait. This on the one hand. Then, around 2,200 years ago, the early Chinese found their way by ship to the American continent, and more than 1,000 years ago, the Norwegian Icelandic navigator and explorer Erik Thorvaldsen, who was called Erik the Red, intentionally introduced into Europe, but as others were also accidentally introduced and were partly invasive and ran wild, stands the term neophytes, which literally means new plants. These invasive, introduced non-native plant species in Europe have since become established, and through their proliferation, have become problem plants because they displace native plants. However, these plants are only invasive if they really spread uncontrollably and displace native plant species, thereby disrupting the interactions between living organisms and their environment in an economic, that is to say economic or ecological way, and causing damage, but also possibly endangering human health. But let us return to the bark beetle, which in Switzerland is combated almost exclusively with mechanical measures and means, namely by cutting down infested trees, stripping their bark, transporting them away, and using them for their intended purpose. It should also be said that the use of plant protection products has been greatly reduced in Swiss forests, and this is also because forests correspond to an ecosystem in which an extremely complex biocoenosis with many different insects, animals, birds, and all kinds of other creatures and plants play a very important role. That is how I can describe it from my point of view, what I learned and understood already at the age of 6 and later also abroad, etc., and according to which I also made an effort throughout my life to orientate myself with regard to my environmental behavior, as it is necessary in order to fulfill my life's duty in harmony with what is right in nature. And I have done well with this throughout my life. But now back to the actual topic. Not only the illegal logging and deforestation, as well as the trade in stolen timber correspond to an international environmental crime of unparalleled proportions, but also to an equally enormous destruction of the forests, as by the criminal destruction of forests by farmers, who do this on a large scale, especially in South America, and destroy huge areas of primeval forest. The fact that the illegal logging is partly carried out with the knowledge of state powers, and even through their protection, and that they enrich themselves silly with it, is probably clear even to the dumbest of the dumb. This, as well as the fact that the whole illegal logging and timber trade is such a multi-billion business, that all those responsible for it not only amass enormous fortunes, but can officially buy their way out of any jurisdiction, so they can neither be charged nor held accountable. And since this is the case, all those irresponsibly involved in the illegal logging and timber trade disaster worldwide can continue to plunder and destroy the forests, which are very important for human beings and all life forms, without being bothered. And it is an indisputable fact that huge areas are also deforested in this way, precisely by clear-cutting forests, and that enormous quantities of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are produced, which also cause human beings to fall ill and die, as well as countless forms of natural life of all kinds and species, some of which even fall victim to extinction. But no one involved in the whole thing cares. Neither the workers who carry out all the clear-cutting, nor their clients, nor the traders, nor the lorry drivers, shipping companies and railways that transport the timber to all the wood processing companies domiciled all over the world, whereby this equally illegal transport also produces enormous quantities of CO2 and other greenhouse gases and blows them out into the atmosphere. Of course, no one in charge of the wood processing companies all over the world that produce furniture, etc. from the woods and thus also produce greenhouse gases, as is also the case when the manufactured products are sent to all countries where they are purchased by equally irresponsible buyers and transported home or elsewhere by CO2-producing vehicles. From beginning to end, the main driving forces in every single case are solely and exclusively the profits, the money and fortunes of importance, for which the forests are completely irresponsibly destroyed and hopelessly destroyed, with even state powers having their fingers in the pie and raking in millions or even billions. And this is also the case in Brazil, according to Playarin's data, where the state strongman, Bolsonaro, has done everything to ensure that jungle farmers and their ilk set thousands of fires in the rainforest and criminally burn down the Amazon forests. In addition, there are various unintentional forest fires which, as contributors to deforestation, favor the destruction of the primeval forests in the Amazon. Fires deliberately set by human beings, that is to say arson, as in Europe, especially in Germany, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, but also in Russia and in various other countries worldwide, are a deliberately irresponsible instrument of deforestation. Only a very small proportion of the world's forest fires are caused by natural ignitions, or are the result of unintentional fires caused by human carelessness, etc. Natural ignitions of forest fires generally correspond to purely natural phenomena, with both lightning strikes, drought ignitions caused by the heat of the sun, and water droplet burning effects, etc. being the norm. In this way, the spread of fires can also cause huge forest destructions. However, the destruction of forests is caused by the degradation of forests, that is to say by the reduction of their importance, whereby the destruction is further promoted by selective felling or by climatic destruction. And in each of the above-mentioned ways in relation to any forest destruction, everything is connected with the fact that enormous masses and tonnages of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are thereby produced and blown out into the atmosphere, whereby the climate is impaired and has long since passed the stage of climate change and has already turned into climate destruction. But also the demonstrating climate freaks and the loud-mouthed rulers and authorities, etc., do not know anything about this, and consequently do not talk about it, as they neither know anything about ruling nor about the truth of the causes of climate destruction. The loud-mouthed speeches made by the fallible, self-adulating leaders and authorities, just to make themselves important, are dumber than stupid children's gossip, which is also true of the naive little Greta Thunberg, who is already under the delusion of grandeur that she can save the world and all life with her stupid speeches. The same is true of all those who gather around the naive girl Greta and pretend to be like-minded, but who, as stupid followers, in reality know absolutely nothing about the causes of climate destruction. Consequently, they only talk and howl about certain climate-destroying causes and about particularly strong CO2 emissions when they hear about them through some kind of information. Otherwise, however, they have no idea or knowledge of the whole thing, which is why they only let out their howls with regard to CO2 emitters and other greenhouse gas producers such as aeroplanes, cars and ships, but also only in order to make themselves important in solidarity, while allowing themselves to be transported by airplanes, ships and cars for their travels around the world. And it is also well known that the majority of governments and authorities as well as environmental protection organizations, etc., are also howling and crying and acting in the same way. And all of this is only done because they are all looking for support, prestige, celebrity, profit and money, as well as to be able to keep their positions and to appear pro-people and in solidarity with the people. It is also a fact that all those who are concerned, apart from wanting to make themselves big, are acting with lies, deceit, delusion projects, and delusion ideas, as well as with empty promises, etc., and present themselves as willing climate saviors. And thus, they can catapult themselves into the public eye in front of the ignorant people who are believers in them, and they can do this in such a way that they can wallow like pigs in a slimy, stinking pool in the hypocritical acclaim they receive from their supporters. But now back to the destruction of forests, about which there is much more to be said, because in addition to the causes for the many unintentional deforestations mentioned so far, many other causes than the pollutant emissions mentioned so far are also to blame, leading to forest damage and even complete forest death. On the one hand, this also includes gradual degradation through grazing, because farmers in many areas let countless cattle, sheep, and goats, etc., bred and kept for the sake of milk and meat production, invade and destroy the forests, or destroy the forests through slash and burn, to gain new pasture land for 2-3 years. Further deforestation and forest destruction is caused by intensive firewood extraction, which is allowed and not controlled in various countries for the populations, whereby, as elsewhere, valuable and important nutrients are removed from the forest soils, because all broken wood and many plants are also removed from the forests, which would otherwise rot and provide nutrients, thus choking off the food and material cycle for the trees. If efficient, sustainable management of forests is considered, then such management is only possible if their care is fully secured and exercised, because otherwise conflicts arise in the forests with forest nature, and to its detriment. Natural forest destruction occurs all the time and is unavoidable, as evidenced, for example, by the volcanic eruption at Mount St. Helens in 1980, which also released tremendous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, as has always happened since Earth existed, and will continue to happen. This is a part of the destruction of forests, which, as I said, is due to natural disasters, including forest fires and violent storms, but which also corresponds to only a part of the total destruction of forests, because in many cases, insects are also to blame, which destroy entire forests by eating them bare. And with regard to the natural occurrences of forest destruction and total deforestation, it is also to be said that although the importance of forest fires, droughts and tropical storms, etc. as factors of deforestation tends to increase, because the human-induced climate destruction causes more and more damage to nature, the criminal forest robbery and forest destruction machinations by the needs of the overpowering overpopulation make everything much worse. And at the same time, they are also causing CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases to rise ever more violently and enter the atmosphere, causing climate destruction to become ever more violent. Ever since the existence of the Earth, as already explained, small and large volcanic eruptions have been associated with the destruction and devastation of forests and other vast areas, as well as sometimes devastatingly destructive impacts all over the Earth. But what is caused by the machinations of overpopulation, with regard to the deliberate deforestation, destruction, and annihilation of huge areas of forest, corresponds to a non plus ultra, that is to say a thing that could not be worse, namely, a criminal conduct unparalleled. As for the conversion of forest areas by clear-cutting or slash and burn, etc. to other forms of land use, this is criminal and destructive even if it is done legally, because every square meter of forest habitat corresponds to an oxygen lung, which is a necessity for all life forms, because each one is dependent on oxygen, which is produced both by forests, but mainly by the oceans, to the tune of about 70%. Through the legal and illegal conversion of forest areas, the existing forest ecosystem is replaced by another ecosystem that is not typical for the location, which not only destroys the relevant oxygen producers, trees and plants, but also the habitats, that is to say, habitats of the species of living beings that originally lived there, as well as the socio-economic functions of the forest for human beings. If not everything is completely destroyed and annihilated, then when the forest is converted into planting and grazing land, the local communities of the forest and the traditional natural use by human beings are at least destabilized, but usually completely destroyed and annihilated. The tropical rainforest does exist as the so-called Amazon rainforest in South America, and it must also be made clear that when the rainforest is always or frequently referred to as the Earth's green lung and oxygen supplier, and the rainforest in Brazil is meant by this, this does not correspond to the entire correctness, because there are various other rainforests on Earth. Worldwide, there are several other huge primeval forests, that is to say rainforests, namely in Central America, Africa, South Asia, as well as in Southeast Asia, but also in Australia and on both sides of the equator, whereby such forests exist up to about the 10th degree of latitude, or even beyond in some places, while in the trade wind monsoon zone of East Africa, there is no rainforest to be found. Whether primeval forests, rainforests, or other forests of any kind, the fact is that they all harbor numerous mammal, animal, insect, beetle, bee, bumblebee, bird, reptile, amphibian, and diverse plant genera and species in their habitats, and that these are only native to the corresponding forests and cannot be found anywhere else in the world. It is also a fact that only a very small part of the life there has been studied at all so far, but this is also the case with regard to all genera and species of life forms living in the air, on the land, in bogs and swamps, steppes, deserts, in the mountains, fresh waters, in the salt seas, as well as in the Arctic and Antarctic, and so on. Up to now, scientists have used a new method for the mathematical calculation of all life forms on Earth, according to which a very precise estimate of the diversity of species on our Earth is supposed to be possible, thus proving that a multitude of about 8.74 million different genera and species of living beings exist on our planet Earth, of which only about 10% are supposed to be known. This, however, Plejaren statements call ridiculous, because in this respect, Plejaren's data clearly show that on all land areas of every species and in all waters of the Earth, there are about 12 million further genera and species of life forms still unknown to the human beings, to which must be added many millions more that belong to the microorganism area, as well as to the areas of spores and fungi, etc., as well as to the area of the spores and fungi, etc., as well as to the area of the spores and fungi. But also in the area of viruses and archaea, that is to say primordial bacteria, whereby if I translate the term archaea from Greek into German, it means original or old, which is also called archaic in the German language. The fact is that a great many life forms are still completely unknown to Earthlings, such as mammals, animals and insects, beetles, poultry, bees, bumblebees, as well as amphibians, birds, reptiles, snakes, aquatic, forest, rock, ice, and air creatures, as well as a wide variety of other living beings that cannot simply be called animals, but rather their own genera and species. And this is so because, as the Plejarens and ancient Nocodemians' science of nature life forms correctly records and teaches, only a living being can be called an animal, and be so called if it is one that corresponds to a mammalian living being, and precisely to a lactating genus. This, while all other life forms correspond to other living beings according to their genera, which have their own special habitus of life that is only adapted to them. Now, with regard to all known life forms of the forests and rainforests, it must also be said that not only these extremely diverse and innumerable ones are threatened, but also all those that are still unknown to human beings. However, it is also a fact that as a result of the massive destruction of large areas of forest and rainforests, the atmosphere and thus the climate are effectively extremely threatened, which not only has devastating consequences for all forest life forms, but also for the entire Earth's climate and humanity itself. Unfortunately, the majority of the world's population is not interested in this, just as they are not interested in how the fascinating ecosystem forest and rainforest functions. So they also don't know, for example, that nutrients for the tree are produced in the leaves of the trees. Needles are also leaves and have the same tasks. Through the process, that is to say photosynthesis, vital oxygen is released for all life forms, whereby the chlorophyll of the leaves, that is to say the green dye in the daylight, produces food for the tree from air and water, and enables it to transform nutrients for the tree under the influence of light and the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that is to say air and water, rain, dew and humidity, whereby these are built up by the leaves themselves. In addition, Every tree breathes and sweats with the help of the leaves, while the roots suck up water from the soil, which rises through fine pipes inside the trunk, whereby the nutrients are transported through the tree by the fine pipes located under the bark. So the tree takes in water through the roots and pumps it up the trunk through fine channels into the leaves. And when the water has released the nutrients, it transports into the leaves. The process of evaporation takes place through small pores, that is to say, stomata in the leaves. For example, a single birch tree, which normally carries about 250,000 leaves, can store several hundred liters of water in its underground, as is the case with practically all trees. This water, which is absorbed by the roots and transported into the leaves, can evaporate through the leaves, depending on the prevailing climatic conditions and the warmth, which on a single hot summer day can be 400 liters of water, which is also the reason why it is always cooler, fresher, and more breathable in the forests than in the open fields and meadows in villages and towns. Through their entire life process, the trees, forests, and rainforests also purify the atmosphere, filtering out harmful particles from the atmosphere, thus creating the necessary breathing air for all breathing life forms, so also for the human beings. All the tropical rainforests of Asia, Africa, and South America, as well as all the forests of all species in Europe and in all countries of the world in general, are very important for the climate of the Earth, as well as for all existing life forms of all genera and species in all countries. 12. Now something must also be said about the importance of the waters, whereby not only the fresh waters are meant, but especially the seas must be mentioned, which as the largest producers of oxygen are the actual basic regulators of the climate, and in relation to the production of oxygen. But also the various greenhouse gases, which are of a different nature than CO2, must be mentioned, all of which have a devastating and destructive effect on the climate. But also in this respect, the naive little Greta Thunberg knows and understands nothing, as well as all her fellow demonstrators and the majority of the government and authorities, who nevertheless all mouth off loudly. This, instead of thoroughly dealing with the effective facts and facing the truth that it is not only the CO2 that has already destroyed the climate, but also the entire environmental pollution that has contributed and continues to contribute and will make the whole thing much worse. The effective fact is also that the pollution of the entire environment, as well as of fresh waters, and especially of the oceans, affects the climate, even though unfortunately, climate research and other ignorant scientists have apparently not yet recognized this. All waste products such as plastics, other plastics, artificial fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, manure in excess, all the thousands of toxins, all kinds of waste and all kinds of rubbish, develop enormous tonnages of greenhouse gases that affect the climate and destroy it more and more. And that this is so, that all these waste materials also develop enormous masses of greenhouse gases, in addition to carbon dioxide CO2, which serves as the reference value, is something that neither various scientists, nor all the climate demonstrators, and also the naive little Greta Thunberg, who, like her followers, has been banging on about CO2, seem to know. However, the fact that CH4, that is to say methane, is produced by the entire environmental pollution in the landscapes, forests, fresh waters, mountains, tundras, moors, and everywhere, and especially in all oceans, as well as other substances, is usually not known to the public, and this is clearly also unknown to the naive child Greta Thunberg and her fellow howlers. Methane is an abundant substance, that is to say a non-toxic gas, and also an important basic material for the chemical industry, and therefore an extremely useful and sought-after gas, which is nevertheless not harmless. Methane gas escapes from natural reservoirs at the bottom of the oceans, from the mountains and other areas where it was previously bound by permafrost, but is now being released as a result of global warming and precisely the climate destruction caused by the thawing of all frost areas, and at a steadily increasing rate in accordance with the climate-induced warming of the Earth. At present, according to Playarin's data, more than 65 million tons of methane gas are released every year as a result of climate destruction in the areas mentioned. However, this is only part of the natural sources of methane, for there are other sources of methane gas, as many more of this gas is emitted from wetlands that exist naturally, such as bogs, marshes, and tidal flats, etc. But there is also an enormous amount of methane gas emitted worldwide from flooded areas. In addition, enormous masses of methane gas are also produced from all inland waters, as well as from forest and bushfires, just as other forest and field fires produce methane that are of anthropogenic origin, that is to say, ignited by human beings burning any kind of material. In addition to the considerable methane emissions, however, other greenhouse gases also result from everything. Nearly as large as the mass of purely natural methane gas emissions is the mass of anthropogenic methane gas produced by the overpopulation of the Earth, which today has already exceeded the 9 billion mark, although this is vehemently denied by all the short-sighted experts of the Earth population counters, whereby at present around 2/3 of this is due to the cultivation of rice, landfill sites, and agriculture. In particular, the focus is on livestock farming, mainly cattle breeding, because these animals are the largest methane gas producers in the entire agricultural economy. Another large part of methane gas is produced by Earth humans' use of fossil and natural fuels, about which there is also something to be said, namely the following. Since the last few centuries, mainly from 1763 of the last millennium, overpopulation began to increase rapidly, following the First World War of 1756-1763, which according to Playarin's accounts was brought about by secret malicious false consultations and machinations of the USA with European powers, and fought out in Central Europe, Portugal, North America, India, the Caribbean, and on the world's oceans. At that time, the Prussians and Great Britain Hanover fought on one side, the Imperial Austrian Habsburg monarchy, France, and Russia, like the Holy Roman Empire on the other side, as did all the major European powers of the time, although all the medium-sized and small states were also involved in the armed conflicts. At that time, the Earth's population stood at around 998 million, after which, however, it increased rapidly, and consequently its increase amounted to around 1.8 billion until the Second World War of 1914-1918, when the war was waged in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, East Asia, and on the oceans, which, according to Playarin's figures, cost the lives of more than 19.3 million human beings. This war had come about because Austria-Hungary issued a declaration of war against Serbia as justification for the Sarajevo assassination of 1914. Wikipedia, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie Chotek, Duchess of Hohenberg, were assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Serbian nationalist movement, Mlada Bosna, while visiting Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. Further on, overpopulation then increased more and more rapidly until the Third World War of 1939-1945 to the mass of 2,550 million human beings. Then after the war, the real great evil really began, because since then, from the end of the war in 1945, the number of overpopulation rose faster and faster every year, and is now in the month of August 2019, in just under 75 years to little more than 9 billion. So through the steady and ever faster growth of overpopulation, the beginning of the destruction of the Earth's climate began, and that already after the First World War of 1756-1763. What is also to be said about methane gas is that its content in the atmosphere is constantly increasing in the course of human activities, just as it is in the case of the greenhouse gas CO2. This, however, is already a cause for concern today, especially in view of the climate destruction that is already underway, because the truth is that methane gas contributes much more and much more strongly to the greenhouse effect than is the case with the same mass of CO2, that is to say, carbon dioxide. And this is also a fact of which neither the naive little Greta Thunberg and all her hooting and hollering supporters and climate demonstrators, nor the government officials and so on, have any idea whatsoever. Consequently, they rant and swear stupidly against something they know absolutely nothing about. In the overall picture of global methane emissions, even a major leak like the one in California looks minor. If it were to continue bubbling for a whole year as it is doing now, this would increase total anthropogenic methane emissions by 1 part per thousand. For human beings, methane is non-toxic and largely harmless. However, in high concentrations it can become quite dangerous in various ways. Not only is methane very flammable, but it also forms explosive mixtures with the air, and possibly also with other substances. And this fact has always led to catastrophes, such as many mining accidents in the past, where many miners lost their lives due to methane explosions and methane poisoning. And because there was always the danger of deadly methane gas concentrations in mines, which always caused fear, the miners took a canary with them into the tunnel, which served as a warning signal of a fire damp, that is to say an explosion, because when a concentration of methane gas rose dangerously, the bird tipped over unconsciously. This then indicated the danger, which enabled the miners to save themselves and leave the mine quickly. What happened to the miners can also happen to other human beings in a similar way, because methane gas displaces oxygen from the air we breathe, causing shortness of breath, numbness in the arms and legs and memory problems, but not permanent damage. Flare-ups, also called hammering weather, and formerly also detonating weather, as I learned in mining school, are considered wildfire or fiery plumes, and these occur in underground mining when a special gas mixture of methane and air forms. And when this mixture is ignited under normal mine conditions by some source of ignition, it cracks violently and results in what is called a fire damp, such a fire damp explosion being oscillatory, that is to say, vibrating, causing first a violent blast of pressure and then an equally violent recoil. Flare-ups occur when a concentration of methane naturally arises and flows from the working gallery of the rock into the mine workings where work is being carried out. Methane occurs mainly in coal seams and their surrounding rock and coal mines, but also in other rock formations, such as the zechstein of potash mines. Methane gas can enter the mine workings in 3 different ways. Firstly, through a regular outflow from the coal and the adjacent rock. Secondly, through so-called blowers, equals methane gas escaping for a long time from an unintentionally drilled gas accumulation, often under high pressures. Can also be other gas and also toxic or explosive. And thirdly, through gas eruptions. Returning to greenhouse gases, it should be said that, in addition to CO2, nitrogen dioxide NO2, and nitrous oxide, that is to say laughing gas equals N2O, also have a climate-destroying effect, as do hydrofluorocarbons. Wikipedia equals HFC, perfluorocarbons, Wikipedia equals HFC-PFC, and sulfur hexafluoride, Wikipedia equals SF6, etc. Compared to carbon dioxide or methane, nitrogen dioxide Wikipedia equals N2O has a weaker earth-warming effect. But now back to the waters, because in this respect the fact is that they, and mainly the oceans, together with inland waters, forests, mountains and landscapes, etc., are completely polluted and poisoned by the majority of irresponsible earthlings with plastic and other plastics, but also with all kinds of toxins and enormous masses of rubbish and refuse. In the oceans, all these substances, through decay, become nanometer particles, picometer particles, and even tinier particles, down to yotta particles, which, with the number 1024, comprise a unit of 1/4,000,000th of a millimeter. Through these tiny and minute particles, all aquatic life forms become contaminated because they inevitably ingest these substances suspended in the water, with or without food, and become ill as a result. And if these aquatic life forms are then caught and eaten by human beings, this also causes them to become variously ill, often incurably, and consequently die. Marine ecosystems comprise over 70% of the entire planetary surface, with their global natural forces keeping the entire habitats intact, but which are increasingly being compromised and destroyed by the criminal machinations of overpopulation. Consequently, earthly humanity can no longer expect a healthy future, and can also neither preserve nor guarantee the security and existence of the earth itself. The fact is that it is not only the huge production of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that causes and brings about climate destruction and the entire destruction of nature, but also the enormous poisoning and pollution of the oceans by humanity, which are vital for the majority of oxygen production and a healthy climate. Without the oceans, all other ecosystems are doomed, and this is indeed at stake today, through the criminal actions and all the equally criminal destructive, and exterminatory machinations and stupid behaviors against the planet, its nature and fauna and flora, by the massively overpopulated Earth humans. In fact, everything is already at stake today, because everything that is being done in an evil way towards the oceans, the Earth itself, its atmosphere and climate, as well as the whole of nature, fauna and flora, will sooner or later lead to its downfall. The oceans, after all, act across all borders and continents as carbon reservoirs, but also as tremendously powerful heat stores and balancing factors and regulators with regard to continental temperature gradients, practically simultaneously producing almost 75% of the Earth's oxygen. Furthermore, the oceans are also responsible for securing drinking water and, above all, for regulating the climate, as Svath taught and instructed me, and also allowed me to see and experience all the workings and interactions in the depths of the oceans, as Simyase, Asket, and Quetzal then also offered me further opportunities to do. In this way, I was able to learn a great deal about the interrelationships of all earthly nature, the waters and all fauna and flora, the atmosphere and the climate, as well as their influences on each other, and also the influences on everything through the weather conditions, the moon, the sun, and even the swinging waves and radiations from the universe. Unfortunately, however, Svath has forbidden me to pass on any great information about this, because the Earthlings would use much of it to accomplish a great deal of evil, destroying, annihilating, and exterminating, which they would also otherwise already do in the times to come through their own knowledge. And if I only think of what is being destroyed, annihilated and exterminated throughout the earth by the evil and wicked machinations as a result of the needs of the erroneously bred overpopulation, then it was well done that I took his advice and kept silent, and also continue to keep silent. The indisputable fact is that on Earth there is a very species-rich and species-rich diversity of life forms, and that in the entire large planet-wide habitat, a dazzling variety of flora thrives and immensely diverse fauna exists, which altogether, when I consider everything with other worlds that I was allowed to see, experience, and learn about, I would like to call paradise. I can only draw an equivalent comparison with the planet Era, which has a normal planet-appropriate population, but which behaves and lives correctly according to its planet, while the majority of Earthlings, through overpopulation and their machinations regarding their needs, are criminally destroying the Earth and its entire nature, fauna, and flora. The large ecosystems of the oceans with their diverse plant life, mainly plankton, as well as all rainforests and other forests throughout the Earth, all small and large streams, rivers, and lakes, and all of nature with its extensive plant life in general, guarantee the fresh air we breathe and regulate the weather conditions, the atmosphere, and the climate. The large ecosystems of the oceans alone are of the greatest and most inestimable value with regard to the function of the entire regulation of the Earth, for it is these that fundamentally bring about all the interrelationships through their tides, which are necessary for everything to remain in orderly motion. The amount of plant plankton in the oceans alone corresponds to more than 90% of all algae species, whereas Playarin's data state that a total of 412,000 different algae species exist in all terrestrial seas and inland waters, of which, however, not even 19% are known to terrestrial marine biologists, and especially not to taxonomists, whose task it is to classify the diversity of organisms into scientific categories. And if the algae are examined more closely, then quite significant differences can be seen in their structures and biochemical processes, as Svath was able to show and teach me on the spot of their growth with his apparatus and devices. I was able to recognize many different levels of organization, as well as structural differences and pigment patterns, but through Svath's teaching, I also learned about the chemical composition of the cell walls and the life cycle of the algae, etc. So I also know that all algae and all other plants existing in all seas, inland waters and everywhere on all landmasses, mountains, caves and in pits and everywhere else, are given certain criteria according to which everything can be classified. But as I know, there is still a huge lack of knowledge and also disagreement and argument in all the sciences responsible for this, because some want to know everything better than others. Therefore, it is also better to remain silent in this respect and to keep acquired knowledge to oneself. Well, the indisputable fact is that day after day, countless millions and billions of these microorganisms in the oceans and other waters produce most of the oxygen available on Earth. These, as I learned from Svath, are designed from the ground up to break down the mineral salts contained in the oceans and also in other waters, as well as the carbon, and they do this when the sun shines and lights up and warms the waters, thus creating certain necessary processes for the breakdown. What then results is the oxygen necessary for all living things and other vital organic substances, which then serve as food for many independent aquatic creatures, such as fish, etc. Only once this one ability of the plant plankton is considered, can its uniqueness and enormous importance in relation to its function be recognized. And effectively, no other living creature can be found on Earth, on land or in water, that is capable of what the plankton is capable of, and what it achieves. In its way, the plant plankton is unique, singular, and absolutely unsurpassable, for as the largest terrestrial natural oxygen producer, it can be said, it is absolutely irreplaceable. Basically, all the oceans of the world together, as well as all the large lakes and other inland waters, compose the Earth's climate, which, however, has already been destroyed in its normal function by the criminal machinations of massive overpopulation as a result of its insatiable greedy needs. Effectively, this is not only climate change, but actually climate destruction, because the natural course of periodic climate change has been so affected by the severe, destructive, annihilating, and exterminating interventions in the planet, its nature and fauna and flora, that it has got out of control and is now having a destructive effect. And according to precise Plejarin's climate change assessments, this is now occurring more than 42,000 years earlier than the next normal natural climate change would have to. In addition to oxygen production by plankton, sunlight and solar heat are also what make the climate possible in the first place. Cold and warm layers of air meet and create cloud formations everywhere, which move over the Earth and bring the necessary precipitation for all the different types of vegetation in all parts of the world. The oceans are also the actual heat reservoirs of the Earth's surface, because they store an enormous amount more heat from the sun's energy and its various radiations, namely more than twice as much as is possible for the atmosphere and all land and mountain masses, etc. The oceans therefore not only regulate the climate, but also the seasons and the climatic conditions all over the world. So the oceans not only regulate the climate, but also the Earth's surface heat balance, and this is possible because the water of the oceans and of all bodies of water has the property of retaining the stored heat of the sun for a long time and releasing it gradually and slowly. This is the secret of heat retention on Earth, because the oceans and inland waters correspond effectively to highly qualified climate regulation systems, which prevent excessive temperature fluctuations from occurring on Earth and climate catastrophes from occurring. 13. Pollutant emissions of various chemical types, but all of them created by human beings, are further factors that lead not only to forest damage, but also to the complete extinction of entire forests, as well as to any gradual grazing by livestock, which deprives a forest of nutrients, and also to the intensive collection of firewood by populations that cook and heat with wood fires. But this also applies to any nutrient withdrawal through other wrong, harmful actions and machinations that bring about a destruction of the material cycles of a forest. When we speak of deliberate deforestation for conversion, we are talking about the destruction of forest areas, be it through complete felling or slash and burn clearing, in order to open up other forms of land use. In this case, an existing forest ecosystem is converted into another land use, whereby this action creates an ecosystem that is not typical for the site and replaces it with a new one. But the original habitats, that is to say, habitats of the species living there, are destroyed and lost. And the socio-economic functions of the forest are also destabilized, which are particularly important for human beings and on which they depend. Such deforestation corresponds to one of the most significant causes of global warming in relation to the burning of fossil fuels and is clearly caused by the fault of human beings. But regardless of the fact that the rapid acceleration of deforestation of tropical forests, that is to say rainforests, especially in Brazil, is precariously endangering the production of oxygen, none of those human beings gives it a second thought or even feels any remorse. Especially not the crazy president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, who is only interested in his power and money. But this means, and the whole world community can do nothing or hardly anything about this, that the tropical rainforest in Brazil is being cut down and completely destroyed faster and faster. But this clearly means that the Earth is being maneuvered and forced into a geochronological epoch that can be called, for example, the human ignorance epoch, the human stupidity epoch, or the human irresponsibility epoch, or the human destruction epoch, etc. That is to say, into a time of destruction that is solely caused by the irresponsibility mania of the Earthlings. However, this delusion will take its revenge, because in the long run, the Amazon rainforest and also all other forests on Earth will be plundered, destroyed, and completely annihilated in this way. And the entire continued existence of Earth's humanity will not only be called into question, but will meet its demise. Unfortunately, the entire powerful agricultural industry, as well as the majority of those agricultural operators, lack all sense and reason, who consciencelessly destroy the vital forests of all kinds, or who just as consciencelessly work with diverse poisons, and also thereby cause destruction, destroy everything, and likewise consciencelessly exterminate diverse life of fauna and flora. And as far as the destruction and annihilation of the Brazilian rainforest is concerned, the fact is that, according to Plejarin's data, it has shrunk by a total of around 14,800 square kilometers between August 2018 and today's August 2019 as a result of overexploitation. The fact is that in Brazil the rainforest is mainly cleared for meat production, namely to gain new land for 1 to 2 or 3 years, after which it becomes barren. On this land, cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, and turkeys are then fattened in record time under often cruel conditions for large animal factories, which are then slaughtered, and the masses of meat transported especially to the USA and Europe to be bought and eaten by the populations. Just as there are meat farms in South America that fatten their animals and fowl en masse in this way, there are also many such farms throughout Europe and in Asia, etc. The fattening food for the animals and the poultry consists of concentrated feed, which contains a lot of protein-rich soya, which is mainly imported from South America, where the soya plantations and the cattle pastures are also spreading more and more, precisely in such a way that the irresponsible farmers, etc., burn down and destroy huge areas of rainforests in order to create savannas, that is to say, tropical grasslands with trees and bushes standing individually or in loose groups. And the fact that not only the rainforest areas are destroyed beyond repair, but also that the human beings and animals, etc., living there are driven out of their ancestral lands, is of no concern to the irresponsible farmers, the meat factory owners, or the governments and authorities. Not to mention that meat consumers in the US and Europe, etc., would also grow a single gray hair because of this, as a result of a guilty conscience. The fact is that especially in Brazil, and also elsewhere in South America, there are an incredible number of cattle farms, the reason for which is that rainforests are simply cut down and burnt down, so that everyone can get hold of land cheaply, and breed and fatten cattle. This is indeed the reason why Brazil has become the world's largest producer and exporter of beef since the beginning of the new millennium. But this has happened and continues to happen at the expense of the rainforest, which is cleared, destroyed, burned, and annihilated for the sake of gaining pasture, on a huge scale, with Playarin's calculations showing that the entire criminal machinations there generate around 23% of all global greenhouse gases that contribute to climate destruction. The fact is that the annual increase in overpopulation of around 100 million newborn earthlings also means that more and more cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, and turkeys, as well as other living creatures, have to be bred and fed for meat, as well as domestic animals of all kinds, especially dogs and cats. This inevitably means that more and more feed for these also has to be grown and transported all over the world, and soya in particular. So it is clear that because overpopulation is growing inexorably by around 100 million human beings every year, more and more meat is being eaten worldwide, which means that more and more cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, and turkeys, as well as other living beings, have to be bred and fed, with cattle in particular being particularly large producers of the greenhouse gas methane. And since soya is particularly suitable as animal feed because it contains a lot of protein and energy, large areas of Amazon rainforest are also burned down for huge soya fields, whereby their biodiversity is also destroyed and will ultimately be wiped out one day. Furthermore, the cultivation of soya unfortunately has many negative consequences. Not only that the rainforest is destroyed, but also other forests, because all of these are the green lungs of the earth, because without all these forests, if they continue to be destroyed, a worldwide catastrophe is pre-programmed. And the vicious and irresponsible poisoning of the soils and waters around the soy plantations also contributes to this, because huge amounts of pesticides and herbicides are sprayed on the soy fields, along with various other pesticides and artificial fertilizers. All these chemical toxic substances completely poison everything. The human beings who fall ill and waste away as a result, all bodies of water and the water creatures that are then caught and eaten, which also makes many human beings ill. 14. According to Playarin's research, soya corresponds to a product that has many negative characteristics and also has corresponding consequences, even in terms of cultivation, because huge areas of forest that are necessary for all life are cleared and disappear. This means that the Earth's green lungs are being destroyed more and more, which means that a further part of the oxygen development process is being stalled, while on the one hand the atmosphere and the climate are being damaged more and more and more by the loss of forests and oxygen, and on the other hand, also as a result of the CO2 and the vast quantities of greenhouse gases produced by the destruction and burning of forests. With regard to soy cultivation, the human beings, the soil and the waters around the soy plantations are also affected in a very bad way, because in order to promote the growth of the plants and thus also keep them free of pests, the entire plantations are sprayed with large masses of pesticides, and the soil is soaked with herbicides to kill the weeds. The fact of the matter is that all these chemicals are poisoning the land and water all around, because the wind carries the toxins and they also get into the groundwater. This is in addition to the fact that some of the toxins that are applied to the plants and the soil also evaporate again, and thus enter the atmosphere and the air through the winds, which means that they are spread far and wide across the country and inhaled by many human beings and wild creatures, who sooner or later fall ill as a result. But this is not only related to the immediate surroundings, because according to Playarin's research, these exhaled toxins drift hundreds and even tens of thousands of kilometers everywhere, not only as far as Europe, but all around the globe. As a result, human beings and other living beings also fall ill in Europe and all over the world due to the toxins they inhale with the air. Admittedly, these substances are very diluted and hardly measurable, but in South America, as well as everywhere else in the entire world of the earth in all so-called nature and agricultural, that is to say horticultural enterprises, they are spread, sprayed, and abused in connection with soy production, polluting the air and the atmosphere. With regard to toxins of all kinds, be it in any form of natural or artificial food production, be it with regard to medicines, work or in the air we breathe, etc., according to Playarin's research and findings, even the tiniest minimal amounts of toxins in plants, food, water, and in the atmosphere and air we breathe are absolutely harmful to health, both for human beings and for all life forms in general. And this fact is also valid when the still extremely primitive earthly measuring possibilities, etc., are no longer able to recognize or measure any poisonous substances, because the Playarin's researches and findings state that all measuring instruments of all kinds invented and in use on Earth up to the present time can only be used to a certain extent, but are insufficient and unsuitable until perfection. Accordingly, the Playarin statements say, the data of the latest research results of the ETH, that is to say the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and the University of Zurich, are false, because they're all clear for crops, would pretend that food crops, such as rice, maize, and cocoa, are no danger for consumers. These false claims are irresponsibly misleading, because consumers of natural foods are thereby maneuvered into a deceptive security and seduced into imprudence. All this is the case because the primitive technology of today, which is still in its infancy, cannot produce effectively profound results that correspond to reality, which is why it has not yet been possible to determine the correctness of the pi number. If, according to the Playarin statements, the false assertion of the ETH and the University of Zurich is scrutinized, then it boils down to the fact that it is falsely assured that toxins of all kinds are not transported from the outer tissues into the deepest layers of food plants. This assertion, however, corresponds neither to the truth nor to the correctness, and can even be called a lie and a fraud, namely because the toxins are effectively transported into the innermost marrow of all plants and are stored in their innermost. This false assertion is based on the fact that the ETH and the University of Zurich have only inferior and for many decades or even centuries to come, absolutely inadequate technical apparatus measuring instruments, etc., which are obviously only designed for this purpose, which are obviously only just sufficient to carry out measurements down to the range of nanoparticles, while even smaller particles of the sizes pico, femto, atto, zepto and yocto cannot be detected, let alone even tinier ones, because the fact is, as Svath taught, that the very tiniest forms existing in the universe are so tiny that they no longer have any size, but correspond only to realities, and are consequently so tremendously inconspicuous that, because they are not even susceptible to collision, no matter how powerful and tiny they cannot even be reproduced by a particle collision. According to his explanations, the very smallest of such realities are so super-ultra-tiny that they can only be called inconspicuousnesses, and are tremendously much smaller than any elementary particle. What the ETH and the University of Zurich inadequately researched was published on the Internet, which I can approximately reproduce in the following way, by means of a flame spray synthesis. I looked this up and found out that it was a novel synthesis of magnetic nanostructures. ETH researchers sprayed around 50 maize plants for 20 minutes each and produced nanoparticles from them. It was explained that when it comes to synthetic nanoparticles and the dangers they pose, there's still a great deal of uncertainty in society. Furthermore, an interdisciplinary group of researchers from the ETH and the University of Zurich has now contributed to the clarification. In the laboratory for inorganic chemistry, the team studied one of the world's most relevant food plants, maize, which reacts when sprayed with nanoparticles and irrigated. The research was based on whether nanoparticles could penetrate the biological barrier plant and distribute themselves within it, and possibly also get inside the plant. Well, as is to be expected, the researchers were of course unable to determine anything that would have corresponded to an effective result due to the primitive and unsuitable measuring equipment available to them for precise analyses. As a consequence, it is now claimed that a reassuring and important result of the study has been achieved, as was the case in previous studies on human lung cells. It should also be said that the researchers also used cerium oxide nanoparticles for the plant experiments in sewage treatment plants. That is to say, a ceramic abrasive material that is used especially in the production of silicon chips, and which, as far as I know, is made from the chemical elements cerium and oxygen, if I am not mistaken. While this material is not as common as other metal oxides on the nanometer scale, it offers a special advantage in being able to detect even the tiniest concentrations of a substance in a plant, although this detection capability obviously does not extend into the sub-nano size ranges. It was further explained that the amount measured represented the actual particle input during the experiment. In the experiment, the researchers succeeded in using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry to determine the particles down to a detection limit of only 0.4 nanograms per plant leaf. Now, this may obviously be a huge success for the researchers, considering the primitive technology that still exists today. But in my opinion, this does not allow me to see and assess the whole thing as a real success. This is precisely because, when I look at the technology and its possibilities alone, as I got to know them at SFATH and was able to learn a lot through them, because they have yielded many times more than the few things that the ETH and the University of Zurich have recognized down to the nano size, then the researchers have not even been able to look into the real beginning of the matter, but only at the superficial, which can be halfway proven today with still tremendously primitive means. It is also worth mentioning that before the experiment, the researchers had exposed the maize plants to a downright violent nanoparticle storm, for which they placed a total of about 50 plants in a special glove box, and then sprayed them for 20 minutes with cerium oxide particles that they had produced in another box using the so-called flame spray synthesis. Afterwards, the researchers deposited one part of the plants aside, while they washed the other part with deionized, that is to say, demineralized water, simulating rain, and then put some of both parts of the plants back into the greenhouse, where they could continue to grow. Then leaves were taken from all the green test plants, first some freshly treated, then later some of the new ones that had only grown after the treatment. What was then found was that although the older leaves had accumulated nanoparticles, these had not become more deeply embedded and had not been transported further, with no cerium oxide being found in new leaves either, to which Quetzal explained that this was completely natural, because the nanoparticles first applied to the plants simply fell away, and moreover, would not transfer to newly growing leaves, and would therefore not be inherited. The maize plants were also watered with water containing cerium oxide particles to determine the uptake via the roots. But the researchers could not detect any particles in the maize in the plants irrigated in this way, to which Quetzal also explained that such particles were nevertheless taken up by the plants, but on the one hand to a degree that was far below the nano limit, and on the other hand various plants would convert certain substances taken up via the leaves or roots, that is to say also poisons, into other substance structures, which were however still toxic and very much diluted. But there is something else that must also be mentioned in relation to climate destruction, namely factory farming all over the world, for which the feed comes from South America in order to produce cheap meat, milk and butter on large farms, which is then nevertheless sold to consumers at overpriced prices. For the production of fodder alone, an enormous amount of chemicals is used, poisoning everything and also consuming vast amounts of water, while countless tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are also produced, which continue to affect the climate and destroy it more and more, causing the forces of nature to become more and more degenerate and primeval. This is in addition to the fact that the animals and all feathered fowl that are bred and fattened often suffer great agony until they are slaughtered. And the fact that a lot of harm is also done with regard to the cultivation of fodder does not bother anyone. And it is not even known to the public that this is an irresponsible destruction of nature of unparalleled proportions, which is even taking place worldwide. The fact is that around 70% of all fields and pastures worldwide are used solely for animal feed, in addition to the fact that rainforests are cleared and burned down to meet the ever-increasing demand for new land for feed production and new pastures. And this happens every year again and more in relation to the unrestrained further increase in overpopulation, whereby, in addition, ever greater masses of CO2 and other fuel gases are produced, as a result of which the atmosphere is polluted ever more severely, and climate destruction continues to progress until one day a collapse occurs. Through all these criminal machinations, which arise from the insatiable needs of the inexorably growing overpopulation, all the destruction of nature, its fauna and flora, as well as of the planet itself, and thus also all the destruction of a large number of species-rich habitats forever, as well as the extinction of many life forms of diverse genera and species, is taking place. The cultivation of soya alone, which is being promoted more and more, mainly in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, for animal feed and as food for the overflowing humanity, is growing steadily in relation to the overpopulation growth and the thus also increasing mass of slaughter animals and feathered fowl, etc. And this because the demand for meat is increasing more and more due to the growing humanity. Soya, which is used for animal feed and human food, has been planted for decades where there used to be rainforest or savanna, and the areas on which fodder soya alone is planted for the EU dictatorship now cover more than 125,000 square kilometers, with cattle pastures with huge areas of land also being added. Brazil alone now breeds the world's largest mass of cattle, currently numbering more than 185 million animals. And for this, several 100,000 square kilometers of the Amazon rainforest have been cut down to date, also producing countless tonnages of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, and contributing to the destruction of the climate. All the effects of all this madness and total irresponsibility, which is the fault of overpopulation as a whole, have so far resulted in a loss of great biodiversity, which cannot be made good. And if the primeval forest in South America, as well as others of a similar kind in Asia, etc., and normal forests worldwide, are destroyed in favor of the growing overpopulation, then more and more wildlife forms of all genera and species of fauna and flora are also dying out worldwide. Meat production alone produces massive amounts of CO2 worldwide. That is to say, not only in South America, as do tropical forest clearances, as well as greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide from fertilizer and methane from digestion in cattle stomachs, whereby these escape into the atmosphere and destroy the climate. And this is also a fact of which the naive little Greta Thunberg has no idea or knowledge whatsoever, nor do all the demonstrators around the world, nor do the majority of the government and members of the authorities who, as a result of Greta Thunberg's mania for climate and environmental protection, mooch around in a loud-mouthed and stupid manner and invent CO2 taxes and other nonsense taxes in order to fleece and terrorize the population. Also the breeding, mass keeping and mass fattening of countless cows, calves, oxen, bulls, reptiles, pigs, horses, donkeys, farmed game such as deer and roe deer, bears, rabbits, chickens, geese, freshwater and saltwater fish, birds, even dogs, cats, kangaroos, mealworms, grasshoppers and beetles, and everything else that is served up on the dinner plates of earthlings all over the world, create enormous masses of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, and contribute enormously to climate pollution. This, however, is obviously not known to the naive little Greta Thunberg, nor to all the climate-demonstrating followers who follow her, including the majority of the world's governments, public officials, and environmentalists. They also have no idea or knowledge whatsoever of how contemptuous of life forms the whole process of breeding, mass rearing and mass fattening is, whereby everything is accompanied by unimaginable catastrophic torture of animals, birds, feathered creatures, and all other life forms. Many of these creatures effectively die in agonizing pain on pastures, in stables, and on transport to slaughterhouses, where they are usually beaten and viciously tortured. In the breeding and fattening farms, all the creatures destined for slaughter vegetate in cramped conditions and are often trampled to death by each other. In truth, these farms do not correspond in any way to effective agricultural enterprises, but to breeding, keeping, and fattening factories, in which all living creatures are mistreated not as such, but only as objects of use, and are completely polluted and stressed in the process. Horned animals have their horns brutally sawn off and wounds inflicted. Chickens have their beaks cut off so far that they can barely eat their food, while piglets have their teeth brutally torn out and their tails cut off without anesthesia so that they cannot hurt each other. In addition to the catastrophic breeding, husbandry and fattening for meat production of creatures tortured from start to finish, however, human beings are also harassed in every possible criminal and wretchedly inhumane way through land theft for plantations, with forest dwellers and small landowners driven from their homes. Their land is simply stolen from them, and this is usually done with brutal violence, and if they do not allow themselves to be evicted from their land and do not comply, then they are simply murdered. And on the one hand, this happens all over the world where plantations are set up, so not only in South America, and on the other hand, neither the governments of the countries concerned do anything about it, nor their security organs, because plantations of all kinds bring bribes and taxes for those in power, and the security organs also profit through bribes. But all these facts are hushed up by governments all over the world, as well as by so-called aid organizations, and many other bodies that can enrich themselves through bribes, which of course is denied just as vehemently as other facts. So the misery of land evictions for plantations, but also for agriculture and grazing land, continues all over the world. The resulting consequences for the displaced or partly murdered families are not only abject poverty, but also disease, misery, and hopelessness. The same or similar things also happen in the industrialized countries, etc., where land and house owners are also evicted. This happens when they are forced to sell their land and homes, or sell them for the sake of lucre, usually because new building land for houses, etc., is needed for the enormous increase in overpopulation. But as far as the breeding, keeping, and fattening of living creatures of various genera and species is concerned, today almost every piece of meat, especially in the supermarkets, comes from mass breeding, keeping, and fattening farms. These, however, exist not only in South America and Asia, etc., but also in the USA, Canada, and in various European countries. Only a small amount of meat still comes from normal breeding and husbandry systems. Meat with the Newland seal is also widely available, but clean meat is effectively becoming rarer and rarer, although there are often justified doubts about this cleanliness, even in the case of organic meat, which is labeled as such but nevertheless contains toxic substances from the environment that are transferred to the organic products by wind, air, and rain, as a result of which there is also no such thing as absolutely poison-free organic meat and organic vegetables, as Playarin's research results prove absolutely clearly. This means that even if organic farms only feed fodder from their own fields and from the surrounding area, and grow vegetables and fruit without using any chemicals, etc., everything is still contaminated with toxic substances through the air, wind, and rain, albeit in smaller quantities than when chemicals are applied directly. The fact is that many people want to save money and buy meat as cheaply as possible in supermarkets, but they do not consider that all the criminally bred, torturously kept, fattened, and horribly slaughtered living beings, as well as the planet Earth, which is slowly but surely being destroyed just as much as nature and its flora, have to pay the price. The production of meat alone is one of the main causes for the criminal deforestation of the rainforest, especially in South America, while in Asia, Africa and Europe, other huge forest areas are cleared for the timber trade, and the various huge masses of timber are transported around the globe by rail and ship, thus also producing huge amounts of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, which also contribute to further climate destruction. If we look at the Amazon rainforest, most of it is destroyed by cattle farming. But cattle, pigs, chickens and turkeys, etc., are also fattened in record time in large animal factories, very often under cruel and torturous conditions for the creatures. All the feed for these creatures is only concentrated feed, which contains a lot of protein-rich soya, which again comes mainly from South America and is exported all over the world, especially to Europe. And since this brings in an enormous amount of money, the soy plantations are expanding more and more, and also on cattle pastures, which in turn leads to even more Amazon rainforest being cleared, burned, and destroyed. So in relation to the growing overpopulation, further large areas of rainforests and savannas have to give way to soya cultivation, as of course do all the forest dwellers and all the other human beings and life forms that live there. Factory farming promotes cheap meat, cheap milk, and cheap butter and cheese, and these products can only be produced in large-scale farms that exist not only in Europe, but also in other countries of the world than just South America. But the fact is that the feed for all animals, cows, sheep, and goats, and also for many other living creatures, is produced in South America and transported to Europe and all over the world, polluting the atmosphere with CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The whole production process uses a lot of chemicals and water, but the animals that are bred, kept, and fattened also suffer. And with regard to soy production, which is not only for the animals that provide the meat, but also for other life forms, besides the human beings who also eat soy products, the animals provide milk, from which butter, yogurt, and cheese, etc. are produced. As has been explained many times, there is a tremendous destruction of nature, whereby, another time, 70% of the world's fields and pastures are used only for animal feed, whereby the rainforests and other species. Rich habitats are not only displaced, but destroyed, annihilated, and wiped out forever. Through the machinations resulting from the needs of overpopulation and the ever-increasing criminal, destructive, annihilating, and exterminating machinations in relation to the further unstoppable growth of overpopulation, there is an unparalleled loss of biodiversity from which the planet, nature, and its fauna and flora can never recover. Fundamentally, the Amazon rainforest in particular is one of the most biodiverse regions on the entire planet. Although many life forms are threatened with extinction as a result of criminal as well as authorized logging, criminal clearing, forest burning, and chemical destruction of forests, etc., these life forms are being studied in the Pleiadian Zoo. In Plejaren zoology, these are not simply called animals, and the whole thing is also not called zoology, but are called according to their genus and species, because according to Plejaren's exactness, each is to be called according to its particular characteristics and properties. Consequently, only genera and species whose genes belong to the category of mammalia, that is to say mammals, can be named and listed under the term animal. This is while birds, for example, according to taxonomy, that is to say the classification of living beings into systematic categories, are considered to be vertebrate life forms of the classification tetrapods, that is to say tripods, that is to say tricephalians, if I translate the term correctly from my knowledge of Greek. The birds, however, both the flying ones and the runners, which are the only surviving genera and species of the dinosaurs, correspond to a subgroup of those ancestral reptile-like creatures that lived about 70 million years ago. Now, the Plejaren zoological designation system names exactly each life form according to its effective genus and species, and thus, not all living things simply as animals, as is erroneously done in terrestrial zoology. Thus, animal species are those that are mammals, that is to say mammals. Further, all animals, that is to say a number of life forms not further characterized, then also birds, lizards, snakes, beetles, butterflies, moths, fish, and dragonflies, etc., as well as thousands of genera and species of insects, all of which are threatened with extinction. And for this I will briefly point out a small number of life forms that may soon no longer exist, such as the pink Amazon dolphin and red-throated brilliant hummingbird and hummingbirds in general, the golden poison dart frog and other poison dart frogs, as well as armadillos, lizards, snakes, tarantulas, parrots, sloths, the gibbon species siamangs, the northern spider monkey, etc., etc. The Brazilian Amazon rainforest is, as explained, the largest contiguous rainforest in the world, and an absolute paradise for countless plants as well as genera and species of living creatures. And I was allowed to see all of this as a boy together with Svath, and gather, experience, and learn impressions that I will never forget in my lifetime, and that have led me to perceive nature and its fauna and flora in their entire reality, and to learn from them. I have also experienced and learnt all over the world that in no other region of the earth does such a fantastic and extensive diversity of plants and independent living beings exist as in the Amazon rainforest, which in the 1940s was still an effective paradise, but today is an inferno of destruction due to the needs of the exuberant overpopulation as a result of their criminal and irresponsible machinations. It is already the case that more than 100 life forms of various kinds and species are becoming extinct every day, but neither those responsible for this nor the majority of Earth humans or governments give it a second thought. And neither do the majority of public officials, nor the big-headed religionists and alleged God's representatives, who should effectively be particularly concerned about this, because they are supposed to teach and spread the divine will, which, if this alleged God's will were to be scrutinized, would have to be such that the Amazon rainforest would also have to be protected and preserved, and any sacrilege against it would have to be forbidden and punished, because it would then have to be a work of will by the alleged God. But this God nonsense can be left aside, because where there is no God creator, such a God cannot prevent crimes, as in the case of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and the extermination of its creatures. But the fact is that also the naive little Greta Thunberg and all her followers and demonstrators, as well as in truth the majority of environmentalists, etc., did not give it any really profound thought. Their true profession is only to make themselves important and possibly to profit financially, travel-wise or otherwise. Once again, if the rainforest is destroyed, many independent life forms of various genera and species will become extinct, as will an immense amount of plant life, including precious medicinal plants that are irreplaceable for human beings. Furthermore, the criminal machinations regarding the destruction of rainforests are also causing the pollution of the atmosphere by CO2 and other greenhouse gases to become ever worse and more destructive, whereby these toxins, which are produced during the clearing of tropical forests, are destroying the climate more and more. 15. What is still to be said is that, as I have already mentioned but only briefly, the forces of nature are becoming ever stronger and more extensive, long-lasting and widespread, as I described as a prediction towards the end of the 1940s and sent to many newspapers, radio stations and magazines with the help of Pastor Zimmerman and my teachers Karl Graf and Gustav Lehmann, but never received an answer, nor was anything published by anyone who wrote to me. What is to be said now relates to the present and coming times, as I have just described them at that time, for now the predictions are coming true at present and also in the future. So in the future, the storms arising in the south of the planet will become more and more violent, more primeval, and will greatly increase in their velocities and extend their works of destruction further and further into the north of the earth. However, this will not only be the case in the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific regions, resulting in tremendously increasing mass destruction of human beings worldwide, wiping out entire villages, completely destroying many life existences, and killing more and more human beings. So the violent storms and tempests will become more and more devastating and destructive everywhere in the Atlantic, on its islands and all around in all countries of South America and U.S. America up to Alaska and Canada, but also in all of Europe, Eurasia, Russia, and all countries far into the east. This will also be the case in the Pacific, on its islands and in all countries around it. Consequently, the whole of Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, and all of Indonesia will also be hit more and more by primeval storms, which will also cause havoc, destruction, and devastation in the primeval forests there, and claim many human lives everywhere in all countries. But Africa and Arabia will not be spared either, nor will the Arctic, Antarctica, and Greenland, which will lose their ice as well as all mountain glaciers worldwide. The fact is that all of today's devastating and catastrophic happenings in all of nature are solely due to the criminal machinations of earthlings, as a result of the needs of all kinds demanded by the infinitely unreasonable and selfishly increasing overpopulation, which is destroying the planet, its nature and fauna and flora, as well as the atmosphere and climate. And this is happening not only out of irrationality, but primarily out of sheer imbecility and egoism on the part of earthlings, who live under the delusion that offspring are all the happiness of a marriage and family, and therefore, contrary to all reason and all responsibility towards the whole of earthly existence, there is a right to produce offspring. And effectively, any such egoistic view and opinion is not only imbecilic, but thoughtless as well as boundlessly irresponsible, whereby it should also be considered that if offspring are placed on earth, they on the one hand also have needs that must be fulfilled, and which consequently contribute to the further destruction, depletion, and annihilation of the earth, its resources, and the extinction of fauna and flora. According to Plejárens's calculations, a birth stop and birth control should have been introduced in a controlled manner from 1980 onwards, because this would have been effective with the Earth's population of 4.5 billion at that time, and humanity could have been reduced to a level suitable for the planet. And this should have been done by means of efforts of the authorities to inform the populations, that is to say by means of a governmental and official educational campaign, which should have lasted for a long time, and should have stimulated the earthlings to reason, which would have corresponded to a non-violent official order and decree. But this was not carried out, and thus the earthlings were not encouraged to reason and to fight their imbecilic egoism, and to behave responsibly towards all earthly existence, the planet, its nature and fauna and flora as well as life itself, and to bring humanity back to a normal state suitable for the planet. But this was not done, as a result of which today, a 9 billion strong humanity with its boundless greed for all possible and impossible bullshit needs has already irreparably destroyed the planet, its nature, fauna and flora, as well as the atmosphere and the climate in many ways, and is also continuing to do so in a criminal manner. So the ultimately unavoidable final catastrophe is already pre-programmed and can no longer be stopped unless reason and rationality are brought to bear. This, however, could apparently only happen through the power of government and the authorities. But this is also questionable, because for this to happen, the majority of governments and authorities would have to be governed by people with the gift of reason and rationality. But that is probably an impossibility, because such people do not exist there as a majority, and the few who try to do their best in these positions as people gifted with understanding and reason cannot be heard, and cannot do anything to lead everything into better and good, as well as wholesome paths. So in the end there will be a huge crash, which will be as certain as that no God can bring help, because no such imaginary delusional creature has ever existed, and no such creature exists today, nor will it exist tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, or at any time until the farthest future. Effectively, the human being alone is the being he considers to be God. Consequently, he is responsible for everything and anything himself, which is why he alone conceives, executes, judges, and creates everything. Thus also the climate catastrophe and possibly his own and the entire human race's downfall. Effectively, a God never created the world, nature, fauna, and flora, and the universe or anything else. But all this happens solely through creation universal consciousness, while the human being exists with all life in it, and is supposed to care for and administer it justly and rightly. Unfortunately, however, the human being is dominated by his egoism, imbecility, and by his greed and by all that is evil, bad and destructive, and is irresponsibly bent on destruction in order thereby to be able to satisfy his degenerations, addictions and vices, etc. But as he does this to the detriment of all existence and all life, he could and should, on the contrary, direct and do his thoughts, feelings, ideas, needs, as well as all his ability, actions and behavior, etc., in the way for the best, good and positive, by responsibly putting everything in order again through understanding and reason. In fact, there is no other God than the human being himself, which is why since time immemorial, every rational human being has never relied on religious faith, and therefore also never on the help of an imaginary God, but has always done everything himself and helped himself. This is still true today and in the future, for only the human being is God, and only he can help himself, which applies to every earthling, as is also expressed in the age-old proverb, "Help yourself, and God will help you." But now back to the destruction, annihilation, and extinction caused by the criminal behavior of earthlings to planet Earth and its nature, fauna and flora, and also causing catastrophic turmoil in the atmosphere and climate. Something also needs to be said about the mountain worlds, because these are not only being degraded in their natural state, but their fauna and flora are also being destroyed by hiking trails, cable cars and associated buildings, hotels and homes, etc. Mass mountain tourism disturbs, drives away and deprives of their habitat the entire world of the birds that are native to the mountains and the life forms that live on and in the ground. This happens not only from spring to late autumn, when countless hikers in the mountains throw all natural life into turmoil. Crazy people with mountain bikes destroy the entire mountain tranquility and majesty. But it also results in winter, when ski slopes are used and masses of earthlings disturb the tranquility and majesty of the mountains, as well as the habitats of living creatures. Last but not least, there are also the disturbances to the mountain environment caused by climbing. And all these machinations that impair and destroy nature and its fauna and flora, through which greenhouse gases are also produced in various ways, are just as bad and completely pathetic and devoid of any intelligentum, as are also all those with their completely idiotic claims, ideas, and proposals, who see themselves as so-called researchers, environmentalists, and scientists, and think they can avert climate destruction and save the world with their nonsense. All of them, like the naive little Greta Thunberg and all her followers, as well as the loudmouths in the governments and authorities, are completely blind to reality and its truth, namely that it is not their stupid, naive ideas and proposals, etc., that can solve the problem of climate destruction, but only and solely a worldwide long-term birth stop and strict birth control in order to drastically reduce overpopulation. Only in this way is it possible to contain and ultimately end all the destructive machinations of the earthlings, precisely when there are fewer and fewer human beings, and thus fewer and fewer needs that can no longer be met, and consequently the resources of the planet are no longer exploited, the rainforests are no longer cleared and burnt down, and the fauna and flora are no longer destroyed and exterminated, etc., etc. Only a mighty reduction of overpopulation to a number suitable for the planet is the only true and correct solution to all problems. No matter whether researcher, expert, scientist, doctor, or professor, all those who bear such academic titles and make their stupid sayings about what should be done against the destruction of the climate, which they still call climate change by trivializing it with lies. This effectively corresponds to their academic education, which is based on nothing but hypotheses, that is to say, assumptions. Accordingly, their crazy, stupid, muddled, and ill-considered ideas and proposals for ending climate destruction are also very much in line with this. In fact, they are all as ridiculous as the proposals and ideas of the naive little Greta Thunberg and all those cheering and demonstrating for this child, because all of them, with their unused minds and their lack of reason, fail to recognize, find, and think about the real crux of climate destruction. Consequently, they also fail to come to terms with the fact of an unavoidably necessary birth stop and rigorous birth control, as well as to remedy their personal and overpopulation egoism in order to avoid procreation themselves. When a professor, Dr. Quaschning, for regenerative energy systems at the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, loudly proclaims, "The technology is already there. In order to become climate neutral by 2035, we must quadruple the installed capacity of wind power and increase solar power tenfold," then this is just as absolutely illusory as many other nonsense claims. Moreover, all renewable energies are basically sabotaged because huge energy corporations want to continue selling their expensive energy, which they produce by producing huge amounts of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. For example, as Playarin's clarifications explain, the IEA, that is to say International Energy Agency, produces studies that do not correspond to the truth. And this is because the IEA only estimates the growth of renewable energies, which means that the data on the number of climate-neutral power plants does not correspond to reality and is therefore incorrect. Interestingly, I have also found an earthly confirmation of these Playarin statements, which says the same thing in a slightly different way, in the magazine Welt der Wunder, which explains the whole thing as follows. How are renewable energies sabotaged? When the International Energy Agency IEA publishes new studies, governments take them at face value. In fact, however, the IEA has been systematically underestimating the growth of renewable energies and the associated potential for climate-neutral power plants for years. For example, the agency calculated a global photovoltaic capacity of 200 gigawatts for 2030, but the real value was already twice as high in 2017. Governments nevertheless continue to use the flawed reports as the basis for their political decisions, and energy companies like RWE take advantage of this. Because if the performance of alternative energy sources allegedly falls short of expectations, there is also no political pressure on the energy companies to change their previous strategies. Well, also in the so-called fight against climate change, which effectively is climate destruction, there are numerous studies that have been working on this for years and decades to produce something concrete against change. Their glorious result, however, is ultimately only that many trillions of financial sums would have to be invested for the climate until the year 2050 in order to take the necessary steps against climate change, whatever is meant by that. The destruction of the climate also brings forth criminal blossoms, such as corporations enriching themselves through it and even raising the price of CO2, as can be explained as follows. Certain reinsurers, for example, have been researching the consequences and costs of climate change since the 1970s, when it was already well underway. It is calculated that 1 ton of emitted carbon dioxide causes damages amounting to more than CHF 200, that is to say, approx. €180. However, the actual damage caused is much higher than what the corresponding polluting companies have to pay for the air pollution they cause. In Germany, for example, a so-called CO2 certificate for the emission of 1 ton of the greenhouse gas will cost around €25 in 2019. In addition, it must also be said that in Germany, contrary to any sensible climate protection, the extraction of fossil fuels is idiotically made attractive, and the climate killer coal is promoted and subsidized by the state with taxpayers' money, also in order to make oil consumption less attractive. What is happening now? Since the little naive and completely ignorant Greta Thunberg has been in charge of everything concerning the effective causes of climate destruction, as well as her demonstrative followers and the majority of government officials and civil servants, as well as certain environmental protection organizations, are extremely strange idiocies, especially proclaimed by leading climate researchers, such as, if we still want to stop climate change and the accompanying catastrophic consequences, each human being must in future only emit a maximum of 2 tons of CO2 per year. 4. Under no circumstances may the average temperature exceed the pre-industrial value by 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. Otherwise, the Siberian permafrost will thaw and release billions of tons of CO2, a fatal tipping point in the global climate system that would be irreversible. The problem. Apart from Brazil, China, and Japan, the G20 countries are currently far from achieving the nationally set targets for 2030. If the worst-case scenario is to be averted, efforts to date would have to be tripled with immediate effect. Now is the time to act also, says climate researcher Johan Rockström. When you read such nonsense, the blood rushes to your face and your hair stands up, because how can a serious scientist write such nonsense and be so blind to reality that he does not realize that, on the one hand, since the pre-industrial level, this level has already risen by an average of about 1.4 degrees, and on the other hand, with regard to the Siberian permafrost soils, they have been thawing for some time and releasing huge amounts of CO2. And this is in addition to the fact that my predictions from the 1940s and 1950s, etc., have also been coming true for some time now with regard to landslides and mudslides all over the world, because the permafrost is also thawing in the mountains, and large parts will fall into the valleys and even sweep away entire villages. This is what I once had to say in detail.
That was good and correct, even if it was a marathon interpretation. It is now after 2:30 HRS and you look tired. Nevertheless, I still want to say that you should write out all that you have explained as a special time sign and spread it out into the world.